Well, hello, folks. This is Caleb coming at you again with another special edition of Caleb's Corner. I'm taking a break from Kevin and I's usual banter over our upcoming book, which, yes, that's still coming. I have a few people still reading that before it goes to publication. But today, I am joined by Sarkis here, and we have a series of videos we're going to be doing in addressing apologetics for polytheism, i.e., paganism or neo-paganism, as the case may be. If you've been following the channel, you've already seen Sarkis has done some work with Kevin on rebutting the claims and metaphysics of Hinduism. And because Hinduism is really one of the last true blue surviving pagan traditions that we have today. In other words, it's not completely made up, like a lot of neo-pagan stuff is. Um, Sarkis has some really in-depth information about how some of these systems work because a lot of paganism being, folk and blood and soil type religions often have a lot of overlap in the metaphysics, as well as presuppositions regarding the divine, humanity, and things like that. So
Sure.
what we're going to be doing today is responding to one of, I'm going to say about five, it could be more in the future, videos by a YouTuber with the name Ocean Keltoi. If you're not familiar with him, Ocean Keltoi is a former Christian. He was a Southern Baptist, I'm guessing by birth. Um, from what his story says, he went to seminary, began to study different things, and slowly but surely his faith eroded him. He went to an Episcopalian church at one point before becoming a Celtic Christian, by his own admission there, which sort of blends Druidism with some form of apostolic Christianity, before settling where he is now, as basically a neo-pagan apologist, in many ways. I will say this. Ocean has some very thought-provoking videos. He's very well spoken. He obviously understands many of the things he's talking about. And he seems to be a very, shall we say, amicable person in a lot of ways. He doesn't seem to be militant. I think he's very genuine in what he's trying to do, in regards to putting forth this apologetic for polytheism.
Right.
Um, However, I think that one of my biggest gripes that I have with Ocean, as well as others like him, who describe themselves as a pagan or a polytheistic person of some persuasion or another, is
Right.
that when they begin making videos critiquing Christianity, is that they often only critique the Christianity that they were once before, right?
Yeah.
Um, so so typically when I run into folks like this, the type of Christianity they are attempting to debunk is a form of Protestantism or a form of evangelicalism, right? Or evangelical Protestantism. I kind of distinguish between the two there because I think confessional historic Protestantism is radically different from evangelicalism. Um, and for me and Sarkis here, who are both from apostolic traditions, meaning ancient churches going back to the time of Christ and his apostles, this is rather dishonest for us because while Protestantism is quite prolific and evangelicalism is quite prolific, this is not historic, authentic Christianity, or shall we say, normal Christianity. Okay. Um,
Yeah.
in other words,
And,
for
and
us,
for real quick, for any
yeah,
historic Protestants who are watching, if you're Lutheran or Anglican, I should say traditional Lutheran and traditional Anglican, we,
yes,
at least me personally, I consider you normal Christianity because
on in practice, yes, practice
in
wise,
fact, yeah.
yes,
What I mean is
yeah,
they respect the traditions of the church. They even though they don't see scripture and tradition as equal in authority, they appeal to the fathers. they
right.
they believe in the real, sort of supernatural efficacy of the sacraments. Is what I mean.
Right, because in it's just a simple matter of mathematics. If you examine the number of Christians or people who claim to be Christian of any type in the world, most of them are either Catholic, there's a billion of those, Eastern Orthodox, about 350 million of those, Oriental Orthodox, which is what Sarkis would be, which is you're close to about 200 million, right? From what I understand, pretty large, right? And then, of course, our brethren in the Assyrian Church of the East, which are sadly around 500,000 due to the centuries of persecution from Islam. Lord have mercy on them. But nonetheless, that's still a working understanding here that the normative expression of Christianity has a priesthood, has the strong belief in the centrality of the sacraments to the everyday life of the Christian, believes in the prayers of the saints, and believes in intercession of the saints, and in regular interaction with the spirit world and the beings involved in those in that realm of reality. Um, and so what we're going to attempt to do here is this is the first video we decided to attempt from Ocean here, where he offers a, shall we say, classical apologetic for the existence of the gods. And we're really not going to say too much about this. There is a few minor critiques I want to make here, or we both want to make here. But then after this, we want to offer a positive case for our own worldview, which may come as a surprise to all of you. But let's get into it here. Essentially, Sarkis, Ocean offers four four arguments, which are often common to classical theist arguments for the existence of the Christian God, typically the Christian God, but you could probably throw in the God of Judaism and Islam as well. And this is the idea of the first being the ontological argument for God. And he kind of opens this argument quite tongue in cheek, and I actually agree with him on this to an extent. He says the ontological argument is this basic idea that imagine the greatest possible being you could, and because you can't imagine nothing greater than that, therefore God must exist. And he says it's kind of a stupid argument. And he's like, what does it really add? And I kind of agree with that, because when you're asking me to imagine the greatest possible being who could exist, I'm like, I can conceptualize God to an extent, but I can't really truly know a God like the God of that Christians have believed in, because he's so utterly transcendent of what I can conceive of, understand, or imagine. So for me, I agree with him there. I think that argument falls a bit on its face and kind of just is a bit of wishful thinking. Um,
Yeah.
what would you say to that one?
Yeah, no, I agree. Now I haven't explored the argument too much, so I'm open to the
Same.
possibility that him and others who critique the argument might be
Hmm.
oversimplifying it, not fully understanding it. Because
Hmm.
in my experience, when it comes to other arguments like the cosmological and teleological and other
Hmm.
arguments, when I find what I find is that the sort of like Dawkins and Hitchenses and Harrises of the world have
Hmm.
like a very smooth brained level understanding of these arguments. So,
Hmm.
so the argument that we're in question right now, as is often presented, not convincing at all. It wouldn't convince me.
Yeah,
But
and
maybe there's a better older version of it that
there very well could be, but yeah, for what he represents here, I tend to agree with him here, because he also critiques the idea that this whole argument is based on the idea of greatness, right? You know, the greatest being. And he says that's kind of a very subjective idea of what we understand greatness to be, right?
right.
And it's like, well, you know, what the Greeks conceptualize as being the height of greatness is not going to be the height of greatness for, say, the Nords or the Celts or the Native Americans or what have you.
And he used the very crude example of phallic.
Um, yes, yeah. And I was like, yeah, that sort of stuff is not conceived of in, let's say, Hebrew cosmology and things like that. So
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. It's a little bit silly, at least from what he puts forward. I would agree. Um, the other two here, which I really think is only one argument, but we'll go ahead. He mentions the cosmological argument, which is the most common being the Kalam cosmological argument, which was made by a Muslim scholar, but has been readily adopted by uh, self-promoted Christian thinkers like William Lane Craig, i.e., William Lane Craig is not a Christian, just so you know. But anyway, or I'll phrase that.
Isn't he an open theist?
He's a Molinist and he's a Neo-Apollinarian, openly admitted as such.
Uh,
And so I will. Okay, I'll say this: William Lane Craig is not a Christian in any meaningful sense. Okay, and um, and his views of the Trinity are very bad too. But essentially, the cosmological argument is that the universe is complex, and therefore it began to exist. And this would jive with a lot of physicists and things like that, and astrophysicists who've documented, things like the Big Bang and things like that.
right.
Um, and of course, the natural logical step to this is the teleological argument. The teleological argument is that if we account for the complexity of creation and the things in the material world, therefore something must have built those with a purpose, right? So in other words, if the most classic example is the watch. If I find a pocket watch on the beach, it's ticking away. I don't look at that and say, "Oh, that randomly showed up out of nowhere, or out of the chaos of the ether." I
Right.
know a watch was made with a purpose, and with a function, and that it's very complex, and that a watchmaker must have made the watch. So these two arguments of the cosmological argument and the teleological argument are interrelated. They're kind of inseparable, really. Um, so, but what he argues is that the cosmological argument works and the teleological argument works just as well for polytheism, in the idea that you could have multiple gods who created different parts of the universe or different parts of the material creation, and things like that. The and he uses the example of a skyscraper, right? The idea that, oh, there's a skyscraper here. He says the monotheist and the polytheist would agree that this was made with a purpose, right? And this was complex, and therefore it had a beginning. But what he
Right.
argues is, like, what is it more likely, that one human being built this all by himself, or a team of people with different skill sets and different contributions built this together? And of course, he goes for the latter, that polytheism is more likely because a team would have done that. There's one critique I have to that. While you could use the teleological and cosmological argument for that, and these are all arguments put forward by Plato and Aristotle, by the way, so they're polytheists, right? Um,
Right.
it kind of reduces the gods to, or the divine really, to the status of a human being, which,
Right.
if you have gods like Zeus and Thor and the Hindu gods, etc., they're not all powerful, not all knowing,
Yeah.
not omnipresent or anything like that, which are
Unless,
traits.
uh, with one quick qualifier, and I can say this as a former Hindu,
Yes,
unless we're
yes,
talking about the Godhead.
yes,
That
and he mentions that too, um, of the various, like, traditions in, like, ancient Greece, where you have chaos, who kind of vomits out the gods, right? And but it's supposedly all powerful and things like that, right? And eternal. And the but still, it's like, this is not qualities ascribed to the idea of
right.
God that a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew would come to. And he seems to have no objection to that whatsoever, which I'm like, okay, fine. Um, but still, I think the other problem here is that, what exactly, in any sort of pagan cosmology, are the gods building anything from? And there is no idea, other than what you see in Chaos or the Gunugap or something like that, of creation ex nihilo, right? You have creation ex materia, a lot of it, right? You
Right.
have Zeus creating humans from mud, right? Which is interesting, because that happens in that happens in the Garden of Eden as well. Although God has already made the dirt prior to that. Um, you have you also have the gods, like Marduk, in the Enuma Elish, who takes the body of Tiamat and splits it into pieces and makes various parts of the earth and the cosmos. You see the same thing with Odin, who takes the body of Ymir, the frost giant, and makes various parts of earth. You see Panku in Chinese mythology, the giant who holds heaven and earth apart from each other, where his parts of his body become different things, and ironically, the fleas on him become human beings. Um,
Man,
but
these cosmologies really don't
right,
make humans, huh?
no, and it's interesting that that's the case. Uh, but I think it doesn't do the cosmological argument all that well, um, especially if you're going to argue that the universe had a beginning. I'm like, well, what material did the gods create that from? And it's even odder in the fact that the universe pre-exists the gods for most all mythologies, as I know. So, as you mentioned to me earlier in our conversation before this, Sarkis, that you said that in Hinduism, creation precedes the gods, right? Or at least that's one of the
Yeah,
phrases
yeah,
that's often
the
used.
devas, yeah, it proceeds.
Right, right. So I was like, so what are the gods making the universe from if the universe has to exist for the gods of various mythologies to exist first? It's a
Right.
chicken and an egg problem, a really big chicken and an egg problem. And I think he escapes this is by saying, that certain beings or things like chaos may exist, which it's like it's not really creating, it's just kind of barfing into the universe and there you go, right? Um,
Right.
and something useful comes out of it at some point. But um
I
at the oh go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say something, but maybe I could save that part to
Mhm.
later when we make our positive case. So,
Right.
for
Yeah. Okay. And the last argument that Ocean makes is the idea of the experiential argument for God, which I think, honestly, of all of these, is the most compelling one, right?
yeah,
I'm not of the opinion that religions got started because some caveman couldn't figure out where thunder comes from, and so he said there must be some giant man in the sky clanging two rocks together, right, to make thunder.
right.
Um, or that rain falls from the sky. Where does the rain come from? So some god must scoop up the water and pour it out of the sky. Um, I really think most religious traditions come from what I would say experiential knowledge, right? That there are people encountering these divine beings or things that present themselves as divine beings. And based on these interactions that mainly people groups have with these divine beings, cults are formed. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it in an anthropological way, that cults
Right.
of devotion are formed around these gods and practices and things like that, and these are passed on through some sort of traditional transmission throughout the centuries, adding on to it as time goes on.
Yeah.
Um, and I would agree. I think that's a very compelling case. But what he says is that he doesn't feel that this is exclusively a monotheistic argument, and I would agree, because we have records of many pagan thinkers, religious people who speak of their ancestors' experiences with the gods, right? And the only thing with that, though, and he says, well, and Christians say they encounter the Christian God all the time. Okay, fine. Um, the only critique I really have of that is when he says, well, if you're a monotheist, you can always just name call and say, oh, they're really experiencing demons. Or if you're some sort of weird monotheist who says, well, all these gods are aspects of this one God being manifested to you in some way or another. So you have this one God masquerading as a being or something like that that you would call a god. Um, maybe I should save that critique for our positive case, but my issue, just as a preview, is how he understands what demons are, right?
Right.
And we'll get back to that. But now for our positive case. And you would think because we're critiquing a pagan, this is a battle between monotheism and polytheism. I would actually argue differently. I would say to Ocean that I would agree with him that monotheism as it stands today, especially, um, is a new position philosophically and religiously to hold. Um, before the 16th century, the term monotheism doesn't even exist. Um, and this idea, especially of hard monotheism, doesn't really exist. And where can we get? So, what I would say, though, is that I don't really believe hard monotheism is born out of, let's say, the ancient Hebrew religion, Yahwism. I don't even believe it was born out of Islam, for example, and we'll get to why that is in just a minute, or out of early Christianity. I believe hard monotheism was actually born out of kind of pre-Enlightenment thought, but here's the catch: using pagan concepts and philosophies. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Ocean, from my Vine and Sarkis position here, monotheism, hard monotheism, is actually the product of paganism. that 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 Christians or certain Christians in the Enlightenment period and in the Protestant Reformation period, which I'm not a fan of either, took and ran with that, and even to an extent, I think you mentioned this at one point, Sarkis, with the rabbinic Judaism,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Um,
I
because yeah, go ahead.
basically, okay. So I will agree with him that the likes of Plato and Aristotle and the other Greek philosophers
Hmm.
were almost all polytheists. I think there were
Yes.
there like when I looked at sort of I was researching the history of quote unquote monotheism.
Hmm.
And apparently there were some Greek philosophers who believed that there's only one sort of perfect, dispassionate, transcendent, unmoved mover sort of God. Uh,
Hmm.
I can't remember their names. I'll pull it up
Hmm.
later. But for the most part, yeah, Plato, Aristotle, all these guys were polytheists. Um, and I would argue that they believed in, sort of a god above the gods.
Hmm.
So it would be more. We'll get more into that when we make our positive case. but uh, but
Yeah.
sort of the groundwork in terms of arguing for what would later become monotheism as we know it was laid by these Greek philosophical arguments. And then the other contributor, as he pointed out, was later rabbinic Judaism. Um,
Mhm.
Man, okay, like I'm sort of like walking a fine line here because I'm trying to like in my mind figure out what to say now and what to say for the positive case later.
It's okay. It's okay. We can just bring it up again. Go ahead.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So in early Judaism,
Hmm.
the existence of other gods was never called into question among
Never ever.
among the Israelites, and then during Second Temple Judaism. Look at Exodus when God is talking about the 10 plagues, right? Um, what does he say? Tonight I will punish the gods of Egypt.
Right. And if there's no gods to punish, why would he say that?
Yeah, and
Right.
so now you have and then you sort of and for the longest time that was just taken for granted. Oh yeah, the gods of the nations are demons.
Right.
They're just not good gods. Um,
Right.
it
Right.
was what you see developing in the centuries after the death of Christ in Judaism. Um, it would take probably an entire anthropological study to really um, get to the bottom of why this trend started to take place.
Hmm.
But for whatever reason, you start to see this trend in Judaism. Although one could make the argument that um, as old as the Masoretic textual tradition is, which seems to go back at least to the early centuries of the Common Era, and maybe even to the time of Jesus and before. So potentially, if I'm being absolutely generous, maybe starting from the Babylonian exile onward, but more
Hmm.
likely in the centuries following Christ, you start to see Judaism hardening into a different position where it
Right.
continues to believe in demons as these sort of nymph-like beings. Because even today in Judaism, you have folk tales about the dibuks and things like that,
Hmm.
the dibukim and all that. So, and then you have also stories of like the spirits of the dead. So Judaism today has not completely sort of obscured its understanding of the spirit world, but you start to see a sort of hardening of the Jewish cosmology towards the idea that there is no opposing forces to Yahweh, and
Yeah. Yeah.
aside from maybe some very minor spirits like dibuks, like sort of local territorial demons or whatever, um,
Right.
there is no being in the spiritual world um, can rebel against him. They all work for him, and
Right.
that's when you start to see the development of what we would call monotheism. Because, well, okay, if you look at the view of if you sort of look at the cosmology, and perhaps we can get more. I'm sure you guys have addressed this plenty of times on the channel before, but um, you start to see in the ancient cosmology, the angels were basically seen as the gods,
Yes. Yes.
Yahweh's divine counsel. But there were basically angelic or divine beings that were working for Yahweh, and those who were not working for Yahweh, who nonetheless Yahweh sort of used their evil to his own ends. Um,
Right.
but the angels were seen as beings with free will and agency. They were the gods. They were gods with lowercase g. Um,
Yeah. And this is where I think that we have to basically just lay it out for our our listeners, watchers here. Um,
mhm.
it is my case and Sarkis' case and Kevin's case, and really the case of both the Oriental and Eastern Orthodox Church, that the default philosophically religious position of the early church and of our current churches now, um, is that the correct philosophical position when approaching the divine and spirits and things like that is monolatry, not monotheism, not hard monotheism, and definitely not henotheism. We'll get to. I guess I should go ahead and distinguish between those two there. Monolatry, in its most base form, is the idea of the exclusive worship of a single deity as divine, as all powerful, all knowing, things like that. In other words, all of our sacrifices, our sacraments, and things like that are directed towards this one being. But monolatry does not deny that there are other beings that are called gods that are out there, that coexist along with this one God with whom we worship, right? Um, Now, this is not henotheism. Henotheism is the idea that we worship one God, but there might be other gods out there who are worthy of worship, right?
Um,
So,
and might even ontologically be more powerful than the one we worship.
Correct. And
That-
some of the groups today that would be considered henotheists, I think most would so Mormons would be the first one. So they worship one God, the one whom they call their heavenly Father. But he's just one God amongst an untold number of gods who rule over various universes and cosmologies. And what their theology is basically focused around becoming one's own God and ruler over one's own universe and having one's own pantheon of followers and things like that. So they said, so eventually your goal is to become a god that will be worshipped one day. Um, so so that in that regard, they are henotheists. And old school Zoroastrians are also henotheists. Don't be fooled. Ancient Zoroastrianism is pagan at its core. Ahura Mazda is simply this high transcendent god who many Zoroastrians do believe created the other gods of other pantheons, for Greece, Babylon, the Celts, the Romans, what have you. Um, and but they would say, oh, but those gods are worthy of worship, because Ahura Mazda made them to rule over this portion of the world. So yes, please go ahead and worship them, right? Um, Monolatry insists that only this one God is the only thing worthy of worship. And I believe that, just for our evangelical Protestant listeners and watchers here, if you think this is some weird Orthodox thing, it's not. You're one of your best theologians who actually passed a few years ago, the late great Dr. Michael Heiser, was put up a case for biblical monolatry, and God rest his soul, a magnificent theologian who I am greatly indebted to. Um, and but I think it's very clear if you read the scriptures, especially Old Testament, honestly, and you look at the writings of the early church, it's very clear that there is a monolatry going on here, because there are references to other gods as having actual ontology in the world. Now, to get back to Ocean's objection to saying, well, now, yeah, but you just mentioned a while ago the gods of the nations are demons, which the psalmist says. I would agree. The psalm does say that. And we would say that these gods of various pantheons worshipped by humans are indeed that, demons. But I take objection to what Ocean would say in that, oh, you're just name calling right there. Not really, because our understanding of demons is a much more broad idea here. For example, the idea of a demon, essentially, the easiest definition is a malevolent spirit, an evil spirit, if you
Yeah,
will.
because
I
in the Greek, I believe in the Greek of the New
Right.
Testament, the word is like kakezeomon.
Yeah, yeah, and at first the word daemon did not have a good or evil connotation to it. It simply meant a spirit. But over time, especially with the writing of the Septuagint and the New Testament, the word daemon became used to reference an evil spirit. But we haven't even talked about what kind of evil spirit this is. Are we talking about little rebel angels? They could be, sure. Are we talking about the disembodied spirit of the giants, which the Book of Jubilees and First Enoch mention, as being demons? Or are we talking about the demonized spirit of departed humans? That's another possibility. Um, and the idea of angels, though they're created beings, who are not omnipotent or omnipresent or even comparable to the power of Yahweh, um, many of these angelic creatures have very strong, shall we say, jurisdiction over things. The idea of angels governing nations, governing cities, governing heavenly bodies is not uncommon. You find this in, for example, when God tells Abraham in the Old Testament, count the stars, and if you can number them, for so shall your descendants be as the stars in heaven, which, for a person like Abraham, stars were the bodies of divine beings. So God's not just telling him he's going to have a lot of children, but that his children are going to be essentially divine beings at some point, which is the doctrine of theosis. Um, but yeah, this idea of there being lesser divine beings that God has created to assist him to be his administrators of his kingship over the universe and over creation is a very common theme with the view of the divine council in mind. Now, as far as, okay, what makes monolatry a better position to take than polytheism? And what I mean by polytheism is the worship of many gods. Um, for one, I would say is this: when you compare what we understand rebel angels to be versus what we understand the gods of various mythologies to be, as far as the description goes, it's a pretty doggone close match, right? Um, Oh, it's like the Greeks would say, for example, oh, there's this guy named Poseidon who rules over the ocean. He has dominion over that place. He can be angry at you if you don't serve him well. He's very territorial. If you were to, mention this to an ancient Hebrew, and they would say, oh yeah, we got things like that too. Or they would call them malachim. angels, right? Which is interesting. Malachim and Melech have a very close linguistic sound to them. I don't know if they're related, but Melech meaning king, and then Malachim meaning angel.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I wouldn't be surprised because yeah, they are called rulers and principalities and stuff.
Right, which I wonder that. Yeah, and so this is not so the word demon for ocean is not necessarily this insult or trying to quote demonize your gods. It's more so saying your gods fit the description of what we understand a demon to be, right? And we would
Right.
say they are ultimately malevolent. They're not out for your benefit. Ultimately, they're out for themselves, obviously. Um, so there's that. Um, but the other thing, and this is where we're really going to get into it, is I think that if one really truly examines the various mythology of various cultures, and of course that would take too long to do every known culture on the planet, um,
Right.
I believe that there is a strong case to be made that every single culture, for the most part, has a concept of this God above other gods, right? That is pretty close to being what we would understand in classic Western theology, all powerful, all knowing, etc. Right? Um, so who's the first runner-up we have to offer as Exhibit A there, Sarkis?
Um, I believe that was Shangdi in China, right?
Shangdi. Yeah. Shangdi in China. Yeah. Interesting idea here. I'm going to pull up some things here just to make sure I'm getting my notes good here. Shangdi is this being that appears in ancient China pretty fairly early. And Shangdi is a god above the other gods. He sits in a council above the gods of the Chinese pantheon, including the Jade Emperor, which it's funny because the Jade Emperor later becomes sort of the most popular god in the pantheon. But even the Jade Emperor is not given the traits that Shangdi is said to have. For example, Shangdi is said to be the creator of all that is, right? Of heaven, of earth, of storms and of crops and of animals and birds and beasts and even the other gods. This fatherly, kingly figure that sits amongst the others and uses the others to administrate his will amongst creation. What's even more interesting about Shangdi is that he's I can't remember what the word I'm looking for is. He's considered more eminent than transcendent in some ways.
Right.
So he's got his energies, if you will, are kind of manifesting themselves in the world in one way or another. But from what we understand in ancient China, we're talking, 1600 BC, he's never worshipped with an idol, unlike the other gods. He's never, there's no image of him that is made, although there was one emperor who wanted to defy Shangdi, who actually made an idol of him, and then he hung bags full of pig's blood over it and shot it with arrows. And yeah, and so and according to the histories of China, that emperor died a pretty violent death. Um, he had done that, trying to defy the god of gods, Shangdi. He's also associated with the idea of Tian, which, if you're not sure what Tian is in Chinese religion, um, this is sort of a how do you put this? Um, so this is heaven, if you will, right? You often see this in for example, Confucianism, the will of heaven. You often see this associated with the emperor. The emperor is charged with keeping up the mandate of heaven, and if he doesn't, he can be rightfully deposed by his own people if he's not fulfilling these certain duties that the emperor is supposed to do. So Tian, so Tian kind of becomes this impersonal nature or force later on with Confucianism and things like that. But beforehand, what filled the place of Qin, or Qin was often seen to be synonymous with, was this very not necessarily directly personal, but a god with a
Personified.
personified being called Shangdi. Because Shangdi was often seen to be distant, often seen to not really meddling too closely or paying too much attention to the individual lives of human beings.
And the
So
will of heaven, I'd have to go find the some of the stuff I read, but I think I remember reading somewhere that because Tien and Shangdi were often sort of associated with one another, I think there
mhm,
were some that almost saw Tien or heaven like sort of this cosmic rule or cosmic law that governs all things as like being something akin to his will. Like so, the
correct.
manifold heaven is like the will of Shangdi.
Yeah, that's definitely true of early China, according to this article on Encyclopedia Britannica, from what I'm seeing here. Um, Another and before we go any further, some of you may say, okay, but that's not monolatry, that's henotheism. They're worshiping Shangdi and the other gods. True. That's not the argument we're making, right? We're not arguing that monolatry was rampant. More so, we're arguing that the building blocks which would later become monolatry, which I would argue that monolatry begot its first true form with the Hebrews. Um, the building blocks of this idea of a god above all gods who is this transcendent being is already there and only makes sense if you see this kind of idea in almost every culture around here, because Christianity um, and consequently Yahwism, which is where Christianity springs from, was not this thing that was created in a vacuum that was radically different from everything else. It has roots in the mythological systems of various cultures, which other people would have understood, right? Um, the other god that comes to mind, and this may surprise some people, is the god Allah. Okay, and please, our Muslim watchers, I'm not insulting you. I'm just bringing up some data here. Okay, so in the Arabic pantheon, prior to the advent of Christianity and Islam, Allah, this god, was worshipped by the pre-Christian and pre-Islamic Arabians. The word, if you're curious, for those of you who are curious, the word ilah in Arabic means a god, just a god in general, a being who is worshipped. Whereas al is the article, the definite article meaning the. So you combine ilah and al, you get Allah, the God, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's a pretty.
and then sorry, I was gonna say
Mhm,
the in Semitic languages is cognate with the Hebrew
mhm.
El or Elohim.
Yeah, you get it, Eloi, which is God, and Him, Hebrew, Elohim, right? Gods. Um, so you get this idea of, so according to this article, Allah was the supreme deity of the pre-Christian Arabs, and Allah is the one who existed before all things and had created the universe and all that is in it. Afterwards, he was retired to the position of a silent and remote spectator who dwelt in Al-Yin, the highest heaven, and he only intervened in human affairs in extreme cases of drought or danger. Despite being the supreme deity, Allah was rarely directly worshipped. Interesting. Very, very interesting. So even they, and of course, if we look at um, Arabian paganism is not much different from Canaanite paganism. In fact, many of the Canaanite gods appear in the Arabian pantheon. Yahweh also appears in the pantheon, which they seem to divorce from Allah and make into a war god, which I think is a horrible thing to do. But you still have this idea of the one, this god that's totally transcendent of all others amongst the Arabic pagans. So there's that too. Um, so what other god do we have to offer here?
Which honestly, if you're a Muslim watching this, I don't think you should be too insulted because
No,
that would sort of support your narrative that sort of God sent prophets among all nations, and so like all nations sort of have a
right.
rudimentary knowledge of God.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think it's meant to be insulting at all. It's the idea. I mean, even the Quran says that when Allah created Adam, that he summoned all of Adam's descendants upon his back, kind of preordained them, right? And he asked them, "Am I your Lord?" Right? and they said, "Yea, you are our Lord." They all answered in unison, and then he kind of sent them back into Adam. And this is why, for example, Muslim apologists doing dawah evangelism will say that you have no excuse for denying Allah as your Lord and God, because at one point, at the creation of Adam, you acknowledged that he was. So you would expect that Allah would show up even in Arabic paganism at some extent or another, right? If that memory is to serve them, right? Right. So yeah.
Which, by the way, side note, one day it'll be
Hmm.
interesting to do a video comparing certain aspects of Islam with Calvinism, but yeah, that's for another day.
Me and Kevin are actually thinking about doing that in the future, just so you know.
Oh, let me get in on it.
Sure, sure. Um, so another god we wanted to bring forward, and you're a little bit more versed in this. I'll go ahead and let you take the wheel on this one. Is Brahma or Brahman?
Rahman. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I used to be a Hindu. I was brought up. I was brought up Christian, then became a Hindu, and now I'm Christian again.
Hmm.
If you want to hear the story for that, the video is on this channel. But in Hinduism, the among the pagan nations, like aside from the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Muslim tradition, Hinduism among the pagan traditions is the one that that has like the most complete sort of pre-Judaic or pre-Christian understanding of this one true God, this transcendent supreme being. And so there's a distinction to be made here between Brahma and Brahman, because
Didn't know that.
yeah,
Hmm.
the N at the so Brahma is sort of the creator god, but he's sort of seen as like a demiurgical figure almost. Who
Oh, and like Gnosticism, yeah.
yeah, he almost like emerges from the supreme being. Uh,
Hmm.
who sort of like delegates the task of creation, or like sort of creates the universe through him in a certain sense.
Hmm.
Um,
Oh, that's fascinating. Considering
almost,
John one.
almost in a sort of Aryan-esque
Yeah.
fashion. But so Brahman is seen in different ways in different schools of Hinduism, but is basically the supreme, transcendent, ultimate reality that is characterized by three characteristics: Sat,
Hmm.
Chit, Ananda. Sat means existence; it has being; it is being itself. Um, Chit means consciousness or awareness,
Hmm.
and Ananda is often translated as bliss, but it's a word that's sort of hard to really sum up, but it means something like perfection or completeness. It's like something that is completely fulfilled or like self-realized or is lacking nothing. um Something, I guess you could say, if we were using Western theistic language, is like completely actualized.
Right.
So he's characterized by those three markers in the Hindu religious and philosophical literature: Sat, Chit, Ananda. Now,
So
oh,
so
sorry.
just to clarify, when you say completely actualized, we're talking like he has no potential, right?
Right.
He's already maximized out, right?
Yeah, like he is everything that yeah,
Right.
complete perfection.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Yeah. So um there are sort of different nuanced views of what this Brahman is, but at its core it's primordial consciousness. Now, the differences between the impersonalist and personalist schools is the question of, at its core level, right? Is this primordial consciousness volitional or not volitional? In other words, does the universe sort of just emanate, almost manifest out of it, out of necessity, or is it a conscious act of
Hmm.
manifestation? And those who hold the view that it's a conscious act of manifestation, namely the schools that are often called Vishishtadvaita and Dvaita, are what we would call the personalist schools, those who see Brahman as the personal God.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
he's volitional, he has intent, he has a grand design. There is intention. It's not just pure awareness that's sort of just aware of itself and aware of everything else. It doesn't just sort of sit there and emanate the universe out of it in this sort of just like in the same way that you like circulate your blood and pump your heart kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Very deistic idea. Yeah.
Yeah, like it's a conscious volitional
He's
preordained.
involved, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. With everything
So
purposefully. Yeah.
yeah, so for the sake of this episode, I'll sort of leave the impersonalist school aside and focus on the personalist schools. And if you read the Bhagavad Gita, you kind of see this understanding of God in all his glory.
Right.
You have God characterized like Krishna, who is really an avatar of Vishnu in the story, characterized as being all-knowing, like omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, uh,
Mm-hmm.
controlling all things, ordaining all things.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily. Sorry, I'm just trying to fix my skin. That's why I'm shaking a little bit.
No problem.
Second, little. There we go. Okay, so when I say when the Gita says he ordains all things, it's not in a sort of Calvinistic sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's more just like he the word that's used is karma phaladhata. He is the provider of the fruits of karma.
Mm-hmm.
He ensures that all justice is done and that whatever birth the person takes in
Mm-hmm.
their next life is perfectly suited towards the teleological end of eventually sort of bringing them back
Yeah.
to God.
Gotcha.
Um, you have Hinduism with the idea of Brahman, and
Mm-hmm.
Brahman is given different names. If you're a Vaishnava, it's Vishnu. If you're a Shaivite, it's Shiva. If you're a Shakta, it's Shakti, which means like the goddess, so the divine feminine.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Wow.
Um, yeah. So
That's so very well developed understanding of this other god, who's both distant but yet close at the same time. Very, very cool. Wow.
yeah, and not it'll be interesting to sort of cover it in an episode one day. But
Yes.
but um, but like not only is the worship of this sort of transcendent this transcendent God like sort of seen as the ultimate end because in Hinduism there is a hierarchy of worship because it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't say you can't worship the other gods, you can, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also it's seen as an inferior in the Vedanta schools, it's seen as an inferior form of worship. The highest form of worship is to Mahapurusha, which the best translation is the supreme person. uh,
Right. Right. Very
and
good.
and that worship, what I as a Christian find kind of endearing about it, and I'm sure Orthodox missionaries would find, is that unlike the other gods where it's sort of transactional and you're sort of sacrificing things to get things or whatever, the worship of Mahapurusha is always characterized as loving devotion for its own sake.
Mm. Very altruistic then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very Sufi like. It's like if you read
Yeah.
some of the poetry of especially Vaishnava and Shaiva devotees like Ramanuja and stuff. Um, it's it almost reads like the Psalms or Sufi poetry sometimes. And if you read like some of the hagiographies of some of these Hindu saintly figures, they're described as like when they would sing their devotional songs, because a lot of these
Mm.
things were made to be sung and performed. They would often sing it, and they would like as they were singing it, they would be they're streaming tears down their face and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
so um
There you go.
yeah, so I'm like, so as a Christian, I find that very endearing. I'm like it's interesting that they came to this conclusion about God. um but
Wow.
Yeah, so I don't want to spend too much time on that because
Sure.
me and Kevin are going to already be doing plenty of videos on Hinduism. So
Gotcha.
the next one,
Yeah.
the next one was Egypt, right?
Yeah. Atum. Yeah.
Atum.
Or noon, depending on
Or
who we're
Nun,
asking.
yeah. So in Egypt, it's sort of a toss-up between Atum and Nun, because Atum is described as sort of emerging out of the waters of Nun, but he's
Mm-hmm.
described as sort of willing himself to exist, which I don't want to overthink it too much, make it too philosophical, because this is mythology after all. But the idea of him sort of willing himself into existence seems to imply a sort of timelessness.
Mm-hmm.
Because how can you will yourself into existence? You would have to exist to have a will to will. You know what I mean? It's sort of like a
Right.
snake eating its own tail. It's circular.
Yeah, the Ouroboros. Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah. It's funny, there's actually an African tale, a myth about a snake that eats his own tail. I think his name is Nuno Baluku, is his name. No, no,
Mm.
Nuno Baluku is the creator god. The great serpent is Atahuero, who eats his own tail. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
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 So,
And
so then the next one would be Nun, which
mhm.
Nun is sort of an interesting thing because in Egyptian thought, Nun is sort of seen as the primordial chaotic ocean, right? But if you look at Egyptian mythology and the iconography of Nun, it's not portrayed as like just a body of water. It's a god. It's a
Right.
personified being.
Yeah, looking at my book about Noon or about myths here, it says Noon possessed all the potential for everything to be created within it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's almost like an early version. And by the way, this is why I sort of I think Plotinus, like if you read Plotinus, Enneads and sort of get a feel for his cosmology, I think
Hmm.
he's a lot more Egyptian than people give him credit for.
Yeah,
Uh, I don't think
I
he
can
was.
see that.
I don't think he was just a pure, untarnished Greek Platonist like some.
Right, because I mean his whole formulation of creation ex deo sounds a lot like Noon when you read it.
Yeah, you have Nun as almost like the one, and then you almost have Atum as like an early version of the hypostasis of intellect. Uh,
Hmm.
I can't really think of an Egyptian equivalent to Psyche or the world soul. So
Hmm.
so it seems like Egyptian cosmology had more of a two-tier thing. So you have Nun, and then you have Atum, and then from Atum you have all of creation with the many gods. Uh,
Right, because Rob is the first one that comes out of Noon. Right. And yeah, fascinating. And we are a bit, I just realized we are a bit strapped for time. So
sorry. Okay, yeah,
but
we'll sort of breeze through the rest of them. I'll
yeah, that's
I'll let
yeah,
you.
go ahead.
I talk too much.
No, no, that's excellent. I'm glad we spent more time on Brahma and Brahman, because I think that's really close to what we're talking about in a lot of ways. But some of the other ones, for our listeners and watchers who may want to look this up for themselves, the idea of a supreme god is very much featured in Africa. So, for example, and he goes by different names. This distant god who is very much the creator of all things, including the other gods, who is unoriginate and thing and eternal and always will be there. Central Africa, and I'm probably going to butcher these, so our African friends who are listening, please forgive me in advance. In Zambi, who is from the Congo region, Malungu, in and Eastern Africa. In Southern Africa, we have Modibo, from the Tswana and Sotho peoples. We have Mamwari, among the Shona and Venda people of Zimbabwe. And in Eastern Africa, there's Weri among the Luo people, creator and sustainer of all life, was one of his titles. Ruhanga among the Banyoro people in Western Uganda. And in West Africa, we have Leza, and cross-regional influences we would have were Inyambe. We have also Chukwu, and then we have other themes associated with this god with this many names. Is the supreme god associated with sky, rain, and fertility, always befitting of a
I don't know. Did you mention Oladumare? Can't leave out of it.
oh, yes,
Our
Aladamare.
Yoruba friends. We gotta represent the Yoruba.
Yes, in Yoruba, Nigeria. I'm so sorry. Yes, thank you. Aladamare, the creator of all that is. That's another name for this deity. So even amongst the African tribes, despite having these many different names, the concept of the creator God who made the others and everything else is a common theme. And the last one I will bring up here is from the United States, and this is among the Native American tribes. This is the god Huacatoca, the Manitou, the Great Spirit, if you will. Um, very little writing exists of any kind because the Native American tribes were illiterate. Everything was transmitted orally or by pictographs by some tribes. But what's interesting here is that much of what we understand about him as being this eternal being is that the other gods that are worshipped by, say, the Lakota Sioux or the Cheyenne and the other tribes who subscribe to the worship of the Manitou or of Wakantoka, um, see the other gods as manifestations or aspects of this one God. So technically, they are somewhat monotheist, monolatristic,
Yeah.
despite the fact it gets complicated with the gods of any culture. Um,
Right.
right. And one of the things I would say, though, is that again, for our listeners here, we're not trying to say that, oh, the whole world was monolatristic. No, not at all. Because one of the themes of Scripture in the story of the Exodus is God revealing himself to this brand new nation whom he calls Israel.
Yeah.
And he he also says, reveals to them that he is the God of gods, the only one worthy of worship, and he does do things differently than what the rest of the nations were doing for their gods at the time. I'll just name one instance of this. For example, in ancient Canaan, they used to dress the gods, meaning they put very expensive clothing on the idols of the gods, and there was like one priest who would do this every day, would change their clothes and everything. Um, the same type of clothing put on these idols is what the high priest wears in Israel. Um, so the high priest of Israel is it's pointing to this idea that man is the image of God, right? Um, so there are very different things that are happening in Israel, but this idea of monolatry has a basis that would not have been unfamiliar to people like the ancient Chinese or the Hindus in India or the Native Americans or the African tribes or the even in the ancient Egyptians from where they had just come at the time. This would have been a concept that would have been easily recognizable and easy to follow. It's not just this radical revolutionary idea that had never been heard of before. Um,
Right. We and another interesting feature about these sort of transcendent supreme being figures in these various
mhm,
mythologies around the world is if you sort of dig a little deeper into them, they always,
mhm,
whether it's stated directly or indirectly, they're always associated with giving law. Not now,
mm,
not law in the same way as we see in the Bible with the revelation on Mount Sinai, but sort of the source and ground of cosmic law.
mhm,
The supreme being, even when this figure in these various cultures in which it appears is sort of seen as transcendent and distant, and people don't worship it directly, it's often sort of seen as the the sort of source of cosmic natural law that the other gods are almost sort of subjected to.
mm,
Like like there's sort of this law, this higher natural law that's above even the gods, and that even the gods uh, sort of obey, whether you term it as fate, like all the gods are subject to fate.
Mot in Egyptian mythology. Yeah.
Yeah, Ma'at, sort of cosmic justice, Dharma in Hinduism, the Tao in China.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so you sort of see like not only is this creator this mysterious transcendent being seen as the creator of all things, but also sort of the cosmic lawgiver.
Yeah, and it's funny, you'll even see this when God is speaking to Moses, the God seer on Sinai. A lot of the laws that he gives him, his justification for it to Moses is, I am Yahweh. Right? He gives him no other justification. He doesn't say, oh, there's this law above me we have to enforce. He literally just says, I am Yahweh. It's like, in other words,
Right.
that's all the justification I need to give you this law because I say so. Um,
And I'm
right.
going to, and I'm actually going to, I'm going to sort of make like a little bit of an appeal to our polytheist friends here, because
Hmm.
a common practice, because as polytheistic cultures sort of interacted, right? The
Hmm.
question then arose, because you have Greeks who have the sun god Helios, and then
Hmm.
you have the Egyptians who have the sun god Ra or whatever, right? And then
Yeah.
you have the question emerge, well, who is the true sun god? Who is it that who is it that governs that part of the cosmos, right? Or do they sort of just share it between themselves? Do all the sun gods of all the different pantheons sort of share that duty?
Hmm.
How does that work? There are various answers to that, but one of the common answers in the pagan world was syncretism. Like where the Greeks and the Egyptians would sort of look at each other as sun god, for example, and say, "Oh, your Helios is our Ra, and our Ra is your Helios."
Right.
Like
And you
we're worshiping
even
the
see
same
this.
sun god.
Right. You even see this in Indo-European like linguistic studies regarding religion and the gods, is that, like, for example, Zeus and Tyr, which is the Nordic sky god, are the same root word in Indo-European for sky, right? Or you'll see, for example, even the name Jupiter, the Roman
But
god, Eupater, yeah, the father Zeus, sky father, yeah.
yeah, it's believed to be from like Deus Pater, Father God.
Right. So it's like so you even see that even amongst different pantheons, there's this idea of like, oh, these are the same god because they have the same root word, right? And thing like that. I mean, if you just even look at Baal, for example, and compare him to Thor and Zeus, there's some stunning similarities between those three, or among those three. So yeah, that's not a necessarily different. I mean, you even have gods, like the same god with multiple hypostases that are as different as the day is long. Like you have Zeus Xenios, Zeus Lycanos, right? All that kind of stuff.
Right.
Um, so the gods are quite complex. And because of that complexity, one of the things I guess this will be my closing remark to Ocean, um, is that one of the things he says is that with the experiential argument is that whenever you start claiming that encounters with the gods of various pantheons is, this is an encounter with demons, right? It's not an encounter with what the pagans actually say it is, right? That what you're doing is you're name calling and you're demonizing, other people's experiences. Um, and I would have to ask Ocean if that is without warrant to do so. And I'm not just basing this purely on because the psalmist says the gods of the nations are demons. What I would say is, have you looked at your own mythology? you know, um, the gods of let's say Zeus, for example, is not above lying, right, to you, to get what he wants. Odin is not above deceiving and lying. In fact, one of his epithets, because Odin has a lot of names, is the most cunning and deceiving one, right? So I would think that knowing that these gods are capable of lying to you and deceiving you and leading you astray for whatever their own ends are. I'm sorry, my kids are in here. Um, Whatever the case may be, I think because the gods are liars and because the gods are deceivers and because the gods are quite cunning to get what they want, I think that there's ample reason to question whether or not that what that person is encountering is in fact what they understand their god to be. I'm not saying that people haven't encountered Zeus or Thor or any of these other gods.
Right.
I'm saying, do you really want to try to make the case that these gods are these good, benevolent beings that are out for your good? I don't think even ancient pagans would have ever thought that about their gods. I mean, the Greeks
Right.
had no word for a love for gods. Buddhism, for example, one quote I like to bring up, and in fact, I'll bring it up here as we close out here. Um, there was a Buddhist philosopher who once said, "The gods are all eternal scoundrels incapable of dissolving the suffering of impermanence, and those who serve them and venerate them may even in this world sink into the sea of sorrow. We know the gods are false and have no concrete being." I would disagree there, but you get the idea. "Therefore, the wise man believes them not. The fate of the world depends on causes and conditions. Therefore, a wise man does not rely on the gods." This was said by uh, Nagarjuna, Buddhist philosopher, lived between
Yeah,
150 and
one of
250
the great
BC.
Buddhist philosophers. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a feeling you'd know who that is. But well, I guess he's right. The gods don't have concrete material being, but they do have being, right?
Well, no, he's not saying they don't exist. He's saying like they don't exist in and of themselves. They're not independent.
Okay, yeah, okay, that makes sense. I knew I had to be misinterpreting that because Buddhists do believe gods exist. That's not even a question,
Right,
right?
right. So
Right.
it's sort of yeah, because in order to sort of understand Buddhism, you have this idea of dependent origination, that this exists because that exists. The tree exists because the sun, and
Cause and effect. Yeah.
yeah, like you sort of have this web of relations, which from a Christian, if for anybody who follows the Lord of Spirits, I as a Christian would not object to this Buddhist cosmology, so long as we're talking about created beings.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Yeah, I think it's just hard to conceptualize for most Buddhists the idea of an uncreated being who's always been there, and there's various reasons for that, as we know. But
Yeah, definitely something to address in future videos. But
yeah,
I would say if one is a polytheist, you sort of have two options.
hmm
Either you have to take the mythology for what it is and accept it in spite of it. That
yeah,
Zeus really is sort of a lying, like
shape
fornicating.
shifting rapist.
Yeah, right. That Horus essentially sodomized his uncle.
Right, and
And,
that
and
yeah, and Odin is a conniving old bastard who enjoys killing and things like that. You
yeah,
know?
and Thor is like a warmongering drunkard that like
Yes,
either you have to take what the mythology says as is
right.
and essentially own up to the fact that we are worshiping beings with these characteristics, right?
hmm
Or you take the sort of Greek philosophical approach of these are all allegorical tales, and that the gods are really these high sort of dispassionate, loving, transcendent beings, which is sort of the line that was taken up by Plato, Aristotle, various early Greek philosophers,
Julian the Apostate, yeah,
Julian the Apostate, and then really sort of came into its own in the school of Neoplatonism, especially like Proclean Neoplatonism.
right,
Uh,
right,
and so you sort of really just have you have those two options if you're a polytheist, and
right,
uh, like if you sort of take the if you sort of take the approach of the first approach, then you're essentially a moral relativist, because what's good is basically whatever god I'm worshiping says is good. And
right.
if that god wants me to have orgies, even with like say prepubescent children or something,
I.e. Dionysius. Yeah.
then that's
Yeah.
good. Like,
Right. And then it becomes a form of diabolism where good can just be whatever, like you said, whatever certain God says it is. But even then, the ancients understood their gods to be a mixture of good and evil. It's just some were more evil or more good than
right,
others,
right.
right? I mean, I think I would have more respect for a neo-pagan, position if the neo-pagans were willing to, and I don't know if this is Ocean's position. I'll let Ocean speak for himself. Um, if they were willing to say, for example, um, the gods are jerks, but they're useful jerks, right? Instead of
Yeah.
trying to play them up as these honorable, idealistic, archetypal characters, which I don't think any ancient person in their right mind
Right.
ever thought
And, and
that.
and even I, as a
Right.
former Hindu, can tell you, like if you read the Puranic literature in Hinduism, the gods and goddesses could be serious assholes sometimes. The
Yeah, yeah.
the 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 only god that's seen as like truly good in this sort of transcendent way is the Godhead himself. Whether you understand that to be Vishnu or Shiva or the goddess Shakti or whatever, but the
Mhm.
devas themselves, Indra often gets into affairs with mortal women. There's actually a hilarious story where he slept with the wife of a rishi, a sage, right? And when that
Mhm.
rishi came home, he was so angry he actually cursed Indra. Yeah, in Hindu mythology, humans can curse devas. And
Right, you can curse Zeus in Greek mythology, and as long as you give him his sacrifice, he's fine. He'll leave you alone. Right.
so this rishi curses Indra for his act of like sexual scoundrel, like his act of sexual impropriety, right? And his curse
Hmm.
is that his body sprouts 1,000 vaginas.
Oh, that is such a bro thing for a petty god to do to some guy who
and
made
then,
him mad.
and then and then and then okay, credit to my Hindu brothers and sisters, man. Like I gotta give it to them. Their mythology definitely has a sense of humor, and
Yeah.
also their understanding of the Godhead is
Good
also that he
gracious.
has a sense of humor, because in that same story, right, out of a mixture of amusement and pity,
Hmm.
Vishnu, the supreme being, give turns the vaginas into eyes, and he says, "There, now you're all seeing."
Oh my. Oh, good Lord. Good Lord. Paganism is just so wonderful.
but yeah, like he's
Mm,
Vishnu is agreeing with the guy, like the
yeah,
guy. So like I said, in Hinduism, the supreme Godhead is virtuous. He's in this story,
sure.
Vishnu is agreeing with the mortal man that was wrong, and
Right.
just sort of taking pity on Indra. But he's like, I'm not going to get rid of the curse. I'll just modify it.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't want to accidentally make angry one of my fellow gods on this. Yeah. Sort of thing. Yeah. So,
Well, no,
gotcha.
no, not one of his like. No, I mean he doesn't in this story. He
Oh,
doesn't
okay.
have. He's a supreme being. He doesn't answer to anyone. But what I'm saying
Oh,
is,
you got a point.
he
Yeah.
he out of compassion for the mortal who Indra wronged, he's not
Hmm.
taking away the curse. He's just modifying it out of a mixture of pity and amusement for Indra.
Ah, I see. I
but uh,
see.
but yeah. So the you basically either have to worship the gods as depicted in your mythology, or you have to take the Proclean approach of allegorism. And at that point, it raises a whole bunch of questions, right? Because um, it raises the question of, well, okay, so if the being that is sort of presented in the mythology as Zeus is not how he's presented in the mythology, right? Uh, and he's sort of this archetypical, transcendent, dispassionate, almost basically uncreated angelic being, right?
Right.
At that point, how do you even like what is left anymore, right? Well, how do you know his
Right.
name is Zeus? Is maybe that's just what people call him because of the specific attributes that he possesses. Uh, Other cultures might call him something else or whatever, especially if you believe in pagan syncretism, that people sort of worship the same gods but give them different names. In
Hmm.
cultures like
Hmm.
Helios and Zeus. Sorry, Helios and Ra are the same god or whatever, right? At that point, you've basically stripped the god of its selfhood and essentially said, okay, you have this archetypical angelic being that
Hmm.
at least in our culture, reveals himself in this sort of form, either a wolf or an eagle, or as like an old man with a wrestler's body or whatever. And that's how he reveals
Rip
himself in
Flair.
the vision.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Woo!
um, so at that point, you've almost like descended into a sort of impersonalism. Now,
Right.
I would
Or
argue
deism. Yeah.
yeah, or deism, like polydeism. I would argue that for us Christians, there is a little bit of this, but yes
Hmm.
and no. I might elaborate more on this in a future video, and I'll make this quick because I know we're
Yeah,
playing for time. I'm sorry.
it's all right.
But I would argue, and I have not fully decided on this position, but I would argue that Yahweh, the way
Hmm.
he sort of reveals himself, right? Like, first of all, I don't think God speaks Hebrew. Like, sorry, rabbinic Jewish friends. Like,
Right.
the
I'm
we're
sure he knows how to speak Hebrew, but I think that's his native language. No. No.
no, no, yeah, like Hebrew isn't some sort of primordial divine language. God didn't
No.
create the cosmos using the Hebrew alphabet. Sorry, guys. Nor did he create the cosmos using Sanskrit alphabet and sounds. Sorry, Shavites.
Hmm.
Because yeah, there are some of those in Hinduism as well. But I would argue that God transcends all of these labels, including even the way in which he reveals himself in scripture.
Yes,
That he really because even the name Yahweh, right? It means like well, the
I
etymology is
am.
debated, but
Yeah.
you know, Father Stephen D. Young thinks it means he who causes things to be, he who causes to be.
Hmm.
That's why he keeps saying, "I am Yahweh. You will know that I am Yahweh. You will know that I am the one who causes things to be." Uh,
Hmm.
that's like that's just the Hebrew title for him. It's almost like as I was reading like one book written by it was like on Orthodox theology, right? But the author of the book said the name that he gives is almost the refusal of a name.
Hmm.
He's almost saying like I have no name you can comprehend. So I would argue that to a certain degree, and I really want to qualify what I'm saying here, lest I get some people's goats or whatever, that the same thing that I was sort of saying, like this Proclean, almost like stripping the gods of their mythological attributes down to like
Hmm.
their like transcended archetypes or whatever, is to a certain degree what I would argue is true of the one true God. But the difference is that we believe that he revealed himself, to a chosen people in language that they could understand. In other words, I don't believe Yahweh is confined to the Hebrew language and cosmology through which he revealed himself, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Right.
Um,
Gotcha.
it, like that's how he chose to reveal himself. That's the group of people he chose to reveal himself to. So he revealed himself in their language, using language and cosmological imagery that they can understand.
I would agree. I would agree. All right,
So,
guys.
just sorry,
Good.
I'm almost done. So, I would argue, because of this, I would argue that all these sort of dim pre-Judeo-Christian understandings of God, whether you have Shangdi in China, the supreme person Mahapurusha in India,
Hello, Damari in Africa. Yeah.
the various names given in Bantu cosmology,
Hmm.
Oladumare, all these are the same supreme being
Hmm.
prior to the that these people dimly were aware of prior to the
Hmm.
coming of Christian missionaries.
Yep. Oh
Sorry.
yeah,
Now
Orthodox
I'm done. Now
missionaries
I'm
talk
done.
about
I'm
this quite a bit.
sorry.
No, you're right, and because the Inuit said that to I think it was at St. Herman of Alaska, that they had been visited by these angelic creatures who said that, like, don't worship us, but there's this ancient god your ancestors remembered. There's going to be this old man with a big beard wearing black that's going to come to you and tell you all about him. So here's what you need to do in the meantime. So yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree. So folks, we're going to continue this. We have several other videos from Ocean Keltoi that we want to address on this channel. He's done a video on the Trinity. He's done a video on several other topics in regards to paganism and things like that, and hopefully we'll be able to address those in the coming months. But anyway, show this video to your friends and family, especially those who might be identifying as neo-pagans. And I'll even put this out there. Ocean, if you're watching this, this is an open invitation to come on here and talk to myself or talk to Sarkis or the both of us. I don't care. We'd love to have you here. It'd be interesting to actually get you know, feedback in real time from you and from your perspective. Anyway, open invitation. So anyway, guys, so Sarkis, thank you for being on here. I look forward to our next episode. So as I mentioned, guys, show this to your family and friends that they too may be freed indeed. My brother, I will catch you next time.
Amen.
See you later. Bye.